Happy spring, everyone. Welcome to The Courage Effect. It is time for me to go into the gems of our archive and pull out another listener favorite. And today it's going to be a conversation about perfectionism with Dr. Thomas Curran. This was an episode that was very near and dear to my heart because I am a recovering perfectionist. And I talk about this on the show. And I actually heard Thomas on NPR, which is what inspired me to reach out to him. After I read his book and found some very helpful and productive insights around perfectionism. Where does it come from in our larger society? I woke up to a lot of ways that not only was I being a perfectionist with myself, but how I might potentially be bringing my perfectionism to other people and setting them up for standards that were not attainable. That was a game changer for me, not just about how I was impacted by my perfectionist behaviors, but how others were as well. In our conversation, Dr. Thomas Curran delves into the complexities of perfectionism and the impact that it has on both our personal and our professional lives. Some key takeaways that you'll hear in this show is that perfectionism is ultimately deficit thinking, where individuals feel they must be flawless to be accepted. And this mindset can lead to constant self criticism and hinder true success. He also speaks to the larger social influences. Our discussion highlights how social pressures and a growth at all costs economy fuel perfectionism. And in today's world where social media and competitive environments amplify external expectations even more, understanding their influence is crucial. And we also talk about reframing growth and success. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. But first, it's essential that we redefine personal and professional growth, really moving away from external validation and towards intrinsic motivation, where we find purpose and meaning in our pursuits. This can lead to greater contentment, satisfaction, and ultimately a more sustainable way to strive. I am confident that you will walk away from listening to this conversation with some aha moments yourself. And it really allows you to hopefully understand a condition that maybe you're suffering from, but maybe your spouse, maybe your children, maybe your colleagues, maybe some friends. Who might this actually impact? And I would love for you to share it with them so maybe they can take a pause and think about, am I a perfectionist or am I potentially bringing perfectionist tendencies into my world? It takes courage for us to look at our patterns, for us to see the things that we're doing every day, how our behaviors are manifesting, not only with ourselves, but other people, the broader impact of our actions every day. Perfectionism is definitely one of those things. I speak this from personal experience, and I'm hoping that this conversation is helpful for you. Thank you for listening. Welcome to The Courage Effect. I'm Suzanne Weller, and this is a show about growth and unleashing what's possible. You will hear inspiring stories about what courage looks like, how we navigate what's getting in our way, and the opportunities that surface when we choose courage over comfort. Let's get started. Hey, everybody, it's Suzanne. Welcome to The Courage Effect. So today's topic is perfectionism. I really wonder, I want to talk about what is the definition of perfectionism, and is it something that you believe really pushes you and helps you to succeed? And I really wonder, what is the difference between striving for great results and perfectionism? Because there definitely is a difference. And my guest today is the world's leading expert on perfectionism. He is Dr. Thomas Curran. He's a professor of psychology at the London School of Economics and the author of the best-selling book, The Perfection Trap. You might have heard him on NPR, which is how I originally found out about him, seen his TED Talk on perfectionism, which has over 3 million views, or his writing for major international publications, including Time Magazine and the Harvard Business Review. His work has had a personal impact on me. Yes, I like to say I am a recovering perfectionist, but I guess I am a lifelong perfectionist in different ways. And I think I really realized this when I had a boss that literally on his whiteboard was written, "Perfection is the enemy of progress," the Winston Churchill quote. And that was something that really made me think about how my need to tinker got in the way of actually achieving progress at the points that I needed to. And what's been super helpful about the work that Thomas Curran is doing is that he's really opened my eyes as to what is fueling my perfectionist tendencies and increasing my understanding of it overall. It's also been incredibly helpful with my coaching clients because I work with a lot of high achievers, and this is something that is very common. So, Thomas Curran, welcome to the Courage Effect.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So, as I said, I really feel like perfectionism is in the water that we swim in every day and we aren't really aware of it. I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit how you define perfectionism.
I think that's a really good place to start. I certainly agree with that statement. I've called perfectionism the hidden epidemic, hidden in plain sight, hidden by its very ubiquity. Perfectionism is at root is a form of deficit thinking, a feeling that we're not enough, or we're not perfect enough, and so really every day we try to show the world that we are bulletproof, flawless, that we have no chinks in the armory, and that we are a hyper functional, um, competent human being. This is the ideal self that we project out into the world all the time. But of course, we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect that could ever be made perfect. And so underneath that perfect idealized version of us is a real self, which has flaws and vulnerabilities and shortcomings and all the rest of it um, that perfectionism makes us despise, that makes us want to hide. And as a consequence, that's why perfectionists feel a lot of self-criticism, because every time that real self is exposed, there's self-castigation that occurs. That's why perfectionists can't feel a sense of success when they do something well, because it's very fleeting and it's on to the next thing and it's the next thing. You've got to keep projecting into the world more competence, more maximization. And it's also why you see in perfectionists a lot a sense that other people are judging, are watching, are waiting to pounce, and so we're very, very hyper aware of other people and their approval and the validation. It's very important for perfectionist people. So if you feel some of those things, it's likely that you're a little bit of a perfectionist. And I think a lot of us do, which goes to your point that this is something that certainly is in the water.
I'm curious for you, and I know you talk in your book about being a perfectionist yourself. Is that what brought you to study and do research in perfectionism?
Absolutely. I mean, any profession, it doesn't matter what it is, the higher you go, the more pressure that comes with it. And I think that was certainly the case for me. I never entered into the academic world as a perfectionist, but I certainly was turned into one as I moved up the ladder. And the better you do, I suppose, the better you expect yourself to do, and the better you feel other people expect you to do. And you just have to keep working and keep trying. And certainly, those are perfectionistic tendencies that really drove me forward. And at some level, you could argue that they're important to my success, but also they came at a massive cost. Lots of exhaustion, lots of burnout, and mental health struggles, low mood, depression, high levels of anxiety, which culminated in a mental breakdown, I would candidly say. And that's when I realized that I have to get on top of this, because this thing that I think is pushing me forward, it's not a sustainable way of pushing. And if I don't turn a corner on it, it's not gonna keep me in this profession, let alone this high place in the profession. I've got to. I basically had decided in myself I've got to find a different way to strive, and that's why it was. I suppose that was the impetus for me to look into perfectionism more closely and try to unpack why it is that it's an unsustainable way to strive. Why is it comes with burnout? Why is it comes with mental health struggles? And more importantly, what on earth is going on? Why do I feel like this? And why do so many other people around me feel like this? To take, I suppose, a bigger look at perfectionism from a societal perspective. So that's the work I did. That's why I did the TED talk. That's why I wrote the book. And here I am trying to do as much as I can really to get the message out there.
Well, thank you for that. And what's so interesting too is that, watching your TED Talk and then reading the book, you talking about your TED Talk and you falling into the perfectionist tendencies as you're sort of reviewing yourself and criticizing yourself. So it really does feel like an endless cycle. And I'm glad that you're doing the research and you're putting everything into it to better understand it and to try to stop it. But at the
Mm.
same time, recognizing how incredibly hard it is.
It's so hard. And I think one of the legitimate criticism of my book is that there isn't a great deal of self-help in there. I never wrote it for that. I'm not a clinician either, and I think that's really important to have boundaries in that respect. But at the same time, I'm also a recovering perfectionist myself, so I feel like it'd be very hypocritical for me to be dishing out reams and reams of life advice that I find difficult myself. I think that's the thing about perfectionists. The toughest thing is to recognize that, you know, once it's ingrained, it's really, really tough to let go because we want to hold on to it so dearly because we think it's really important to our success. And particularly when things start to go wrong, when everything and all around us starts to feel like it's coming down, we cling to perfectionism because that facade of hyper functionality is what we think is getting us through those moments. When in reality, it's not. And it is so difficult to let it go. And I think that it's going to be perhaps impossible for people to let it go completely because there will always be moments in this culture, in this society, where you're going to need a little bit of perfectionism to get by. And sometimes that facade will come up and will succumb a little bit to those perfectionism pressures. But the challenge is not the destination of it, like getting rid of it completely. It's really pointing our compass in a different direction and working really, really hard to find those moments of joy where we're accepting of ourselves and our circumstances, and we can know that what we are in this moment is good enough if only we allow ourselves the permission to be it openly. And that really is the big message of my book. And I think I think that's the message I think of most, or should be of most self-help, that there's no one quick fix, but there's a lot of hard work that's needed to get us to turn the corner on some of the things, particularly perfectionism, that can create problems in our lives. So that's the main message of my book.
Yeah. Well, and I also love that I would love for you to talk a little bit about the different kinds of perfectionism, because that was one thing that really opened my eyes too, is that there's the self-directed, the other-oriented, and the socially prescribed. Can you talk a little bit about those differentiations?
Yeah, so if you look, I mean, this is one of the most fascinating things about perfectionism. If you talk to perfectionistic people, so the conventional wisdom is that perfectionism is a very, overwork, the quintessential overstriver, high levels of self-imposed pressure, and all the rest of it. Now that is part of perfectionism. It is, and we call that self-oriented perfectionism. Need to be perfect and nothing but perfect. But if you talk to perfectionistic people, it's not just those high self-set standards that you see. They also report high levels of social pressure too, a sense that other people expect me to be perfect. That's why I'm driving so hard, because other people are watching and they're waiting to pounce if I'm not perfect. That's called socially prescribed perfectionism. And then you see a third element of perfectionism that also comes out in a conversation with perfectionists, and this idea of perfectionism projected outwards onto other people. So not only do I need to be perfect in myself, not only do other people expect me to be perfect, but also I expect other people to be perfect, because it's only fair, right? If other people expect me to be perfect, I expect perfection of myself, then you must be perfect too. And you kind of create this very strong echo chamber of perfectionism, where you've got a high self-set standards, high sense of social expectation, and also an expectation of other people to be perfect. It's called other-oriented perfectionism. And these are the three elements of perfection you see time and time again. Now, you could be higher or lower on one, two, or three. You don't have to be high on all of them. That's the interesting thing about perfectionism. No one perfectionist looks the same. We're all on spectrums of each of them. But if you're highly perfectionistic, you're likely to trend higher on the three.
So interesting. And that was one of the things that really struck me was, and especially now, I mean, with social media, I know that this is one of the big, I mean, I do want to talk about the changes over time, but we live our lives in such public ways. So not just the internal scrutiny that we have, but so much more dependency on getting value and validation from other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important when we talk about perfectionism, because we often, I mean, it's no, we're taught to think as individuals, right? Everything is an individual problem. Um, and as a consequence, it's the same with perfectionism. It's a very individualized trait people carry around them. And what we sometimes don't recognize is that we all operate in a social world. We don't operate in a vacuum like that. Um, and it, and so we have to consider that perfectionism is really first and foremost a relational trait. It's how we interact with other people. It's the mask we wear to convince other people that we're perfect, that we are this ideal person that we hold up in our minds that we want other people to see. So it's not just about those high self-set standards that perfectionists do possess in abundance. Yes, they do. But it's also those social pressures which are underneath that drive that I think are really important, because that's where you start to see perfectionism become problematic. Socially prescribed perfectionism is the most extreme form of perfectionism. It's the one that's correlated most strongly with serious mental complications. And that's not a surprise because if we live in fear of screwing up publicly or making mistakes publicly or other people's opinions, then we're going to find that we recoil from social situations. So loneliness and social disconnection are very high among perfectionistic people. And we're also going to be extremely vulnerable to setbacks and mistakes because they've exposed to other people that we're flawed. And that has a massive impact on our self-esteem. So I think it's so important that you raise this because that social element of perfectionism is something that's often overlooked, but I think the most important part.
Yeah, and I, I just think so. And I like kids these days. I mean, I look at, my nephews and I see just the amount of attention that they pay. I mean, it was bad when I was a teenager, and now, I mean, and I can only imagine what you're seeing in your students. It's just the optics are different.
Yeah, and they do live in a world where they are under the microscope more. I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah, social media has certainly played a role in this, but there are other pressures, particularly in school and college. We just seen today, for instance, college admissions data, which has shown even more competitive for places become even tougher to get into. More students chasing the same number of places creates incredible amounts of pressure. So they're under pressure at school, college to perform. They're under the microscope in social media. And all of these things, I think, are weighing on young people's perception that they've got to be exceptional. Really, like it's kind of the only way to get by. And so I don't think it's any surprise that we're seeing quite a lot of perfections among that generation.
Yeah. It just reminds me of when I was applying to grad school, and that was probably one of the most stressful times in my life. Just, the obsession over the essay and all of the applications and what I was going to do, and the fear of rejection. And it's hard, and it's a lot to handle when you're young and you're still really gaining that maturity.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would never have made the grade if I'd gone to university when today, it is actually like there is some, sidebar to perfectionism, but there is something that has to be done about that pressure. Whether we widen participation in universities or we just release it in other ways by reducing the number of standardized tests. I don't know. I don't have the answers, but it is it's really really a pressure cooker for young people, and I think it's up to us as adults in the room to work out how we can take that pressure off because it's certainly having an impact on the mental health.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, we're going to cut to a break. I'd love to come back and talk a little bit more about that larger, meritocracy and the systemic causes of perfectionism. So, everybody, we will be back in a minute. Stay tuned. These are challenging times. Sometimes it can take a good dose of courage just to get out of bed. When life becomes hard, it's vital we seek support from trusted, experienced people. If you're going through a hard time, working with a therapist can give you tools to approach your life in a very different way. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and accessible. It's an online platform where you can be matched with a professional therapist in as little as a few days. You can find out more information and get matched with a therapist at BetterHelp, that's HELP.com/courage. Visiting this link both supports this show and gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Welcome back to The Courage Effect. This is Suzanne, and my guest today is Dr. Thomas Curran, and we are having a conversation about perfectionism. One of the things that really struck me about reading your book is, talking about the growth at all costs economy and the whole idea of, a meritocracy being, we're always expected to prove ourselves, to prove our worth. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and its role in not only creating, but reinforcing perfectionism.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me when I was doing my research into the book was how perfectionism really grows in the soil of wanting to be or do more constantly, and that there never being a point at which we can settle and accept that this is good enough. Um, And I think that that comes from many different places. But one of the things that certainly is pushing on uh, that tendency for us to think like that is that we live in an economy that operates on under those principles, that it has to grow every year, can't slow down, certainly can't shrink, otherwise it's a recession, and we know what that means. And in order for this whole thing to continue in a forward direction, we need to work, consume, work, consume more and more and more. And we've got the advent of AI coming onto the scene. Technologies, automation, amazing. They take a lot of work off us, but that's only replaced with more work so that we can consume more, and the process goes on. And I suppose there comes a point in developed economies where the relationship between more growth and the meeting of human needs, human prosperity, starts to weaken, and in some cases it can decline. We're seeing in the UK in the US and the UK actually, but in the US in particular, healthy life expectancy decline, even though the economy is still growing. So that growth in the economy is not meeting human needs. We see in the latest PISA results in the US, educational attainment is down. Again, the economy is growing, but social and human markers of progress are not going in a forward direction. And so there's been a disconnect between growth in the economy and the meeting of human social needs. And what I'm saying with perfectionism, and the link I'm trying to make with perfectionism, is what this is creating is an existential anxiety where people are being pushed to continually self-improve, have more, be more, do more, but the economy and is not meeting them in the middle, and it's becoming harder for them to get by. Wages in the UK, certainly, I know it's a different story in the US, but stagnated. Young people find it hard to get jobs and move on with their lives. And the college premium is now confined to the Ivy League institutions. It's incredibly difficult to get into. So all of this pressure is culminating, I think, in levels of perfectionism. And if you want to get to the root of it, I trace their lineage to an economy that has to grow at all costs. And there's nothing wrong with growth per se. I have to make this point. And there's nothing wrong with meritocracy per se, but it has to be broad based. After the war, economy was growing to benefit people, right? We had a burgeoning middle class, the affluent society. I dare say we didn't have a great deal of perfectionism in those days because our efforts were being met with better living standards. That's not the case today. We're seeing the apex of society narrow, and the proceeds of work are confined really to a very narrow elite, and everybody else is struggling to keep their heads above water. So I think what we're seeing now is a very different economy, and growth at all costs is at the heart of that. Now, if we could somehow level the playing field, if we could reduce inequality and still grow the size of the pie, I think that's one of the ways that we can create the conditions where perfectionism isn't as necessary. But in the absence of that, I think fundamentally we have to look at prioritizing human needs and creating more equality and being a bit more agnostic about growth in the short term, because the economies are secularly slow and we're seeing that. And they may continue to do that for a little bit until perhaps the advent of technologies like AI, as I mentioned, create a second boost that moves growth forward. So I'm not anti-growth. I'm not anti-capitalist. But what I'm seeing right now is a squeeze on a lot of people under this imperative for us to grow, which I think is coming out in all sorts of different directions. But one of them is levels of perfectionism.
Yeah, you're also making me think of scarcity mindset.
Absolutely. I mean, this is I suppose this is the a fuel of supply side economics in a nutshell. You have to feel like we need more to consume, more to work more in order for the economy to grow. If we were content, we wouldn't do these things, and as a consequence, we'd find that demand just drops out of the economy, and we've spiraled into recession. So there is a sense in this that there is a systemic need for us to continue to want, have, be more, which is prerequisite for perfectionism. And so in some way perfectionism perhaps is systemic, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think this is so important. It really doesn't have to be like this. There are other ways in which we can build economies, particularly developed economies, where we live in an era of abundance, where that abundance, reasonably shared, can provide a good enough standard of living for everyone, and we could drive economies forward through purpose and meaning, through creativity and innovation, rather than scarcity. I think just scarcity is the only way we know how to do it. And I suppose in the last chapter of the book, I'm challenging us to think a little bit more creatively and a bit more imaginatively about how we perhaps could become a little bit more agnostic about growth, focus on human needs and prosperity, innovation, creativity, put a floor under poverty, and let people just go out and explore. And I think that that could just as well provide an impetus to growth as the fire of scarcity.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I love the idea of really, reframing growth. And that's, like it's not just about money. It's not just about stuff. It's not just about always getting bigger. Sometimes it's about, what do you learn? How do you expand in different ways? How do you just open up to what's already there? And I think you also bring a really important point is the whole idea of like, there being a bit of a smokescreen around equality with it. It's about, every man for himself. And that only lasts so far. So there comes a point of how do we come together in different ways and to hopefully support each other and not only shame ourselves, because I mean I'm thinking scarcity mindset, like everything deficit thinking, everything is
Mhm.
based on lack. So how do we do that for ourselves to feel good about ourselves and others at the same time?
Yeah, and it's so hard. That's where you have to we have to take a broader look at this, because it's what is one thing to say it's really important to have an abundance mindset or whatever it might be, but if you are struggling from day to day to get from one day to the next, you got mortgage to pay, rental payments to pay, food, heating
Yeah.
bills, of course you're going to find yourself in the trap of a scarcity mindset, because you're essentially working for survival. And as I say, I think we're duped a little bit into thinking that is just the way it is, but that doesn't have to be the way it is. We can, and again, I'm an idealist. But I do look out into the world and I think we've got so many different overlapping issues, crises on the horizon, mental health crisis. We have a huge crisis in the US of drug addiction and poverty. We have a climate crisis that's on the horizon, which is a function of expansionary economies. We've had so much technological advance in green clean technologies, and yet we've only shaved off about 5% of global emissions. Why? Not because we haven't done some tremendous things with technology, but because economies have to expand. And so all of that great innovation is just counteracted by expansionary policy. And what I'm saying, I suppose, is again, it goes back to the point about if we think about this from a psychological level, if all we're allowed to do is expand, if all we have to do is expand and grow and grow and grow and grow, and then at some point we're going to find that that's really difficult, and that it flies in the face of those intrinsic tendencies sometimes to recognize that we're exhaustible, fallible human beings, that sometimes we can't be squeezed anymore. Sometimes there's only just so much insecurity we can take before we burst. And as I say, I think the heart of the mental health crisis is this issue. So yeah, look, growth is not a bad thing at all. Tremendously useful, particularly in the early stages of development. But I think we also need to recognize that it's not all just a human tendency to grow. Sometimes it's important that we slow down. Sometimes it's important we take a few steps back, because that is that is what it means to be a human being. So I think it's growth per se is not a problem, but it's growth taken to the extreme that can be perfectionism.
And the idea of it just like the hustle mindset too, right? The idea of always needing to do more, to do something different. Whereas what you've really found in your research is that it's not perfectionism isn't necessarily more productive.
No, not at all. And that's the other thing we have to bear in mind, is that you can get more from less. And perfection is a classic example of this. It's an unsustainable way to strive. You work yourself to the bone and you burn out. And you also do a lot of self-sabotaging things. So, because there's a lot of anxiety with perfectionism, a lot of shame, and a worry about making mistakes. We take ourselves away from situations where we might find ourselves falling short or making mistakes. So there's an avoidant tendency, there's a procrastination tendency in perfection, which is not at all conducive to performance. So you can actually get more from lowering, recalibrating those expectations, allowing yourself the permission to fail and take risks, because that's where genuine progress and innovation is made. So perfectionism has a lot of mental health baggage, but it also doesn't make us any more likely to succeed. And I think that's also important to bear in mind in this conversation, that actually sometimes less in gets more out.
Yes, I love that. And I could talk to you all day about this. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But so a few things. So getting more comfortable with failure, which is obviously for ourselves and others, not putting unrealistic expectations onto other people at the same time. A few other things that you said, that, perfectionism really grows in the soil of us wanting to be or do more. How can we reframe that? How can we really maybe pause and get a better idea of other ways that we can contribute that aren't necessarily just about more or better as it might be? And how do we find an inherent way to strive, like something different, a different way to strive? I think that those are really important things for us to look ahead. So as we wrap, Thomas, what are final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners today?
The main thing is that perfectionism is not holding you up in the world. It's something that will create a lot of psychological difficulty and make you more likely to succeed. And that's really important to break through as a first thought about perfectionism. And then from there, it's really important to recognize that there's a lot of pressure out there. It's okay sometimes to succumb to perfectionist tendencies. We all do it. But the point is to try to point a compass in a different direction and strive not for applause or validation or fire emojis, whatever it might be, but actually for vocation. I think vocation is something we lack a lot today. What's the meaning? What's the purpose? What are you leaving in the world is the questions that I think we should be asking ourselves. And that intrinsic form of motivation really fires so much contentment, joy, happiness, doing things for the inherent joy of actually making a difference or having some kind of impact. That's for me way more important than validation and approval. And so um, that was the biggest turning point in my professional life, was to try to make a difference in the world rather than do something to climb an academic ladder or the outcomes, whatever. So I I hope that's helpful, and I'll leave that with your listeners.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for giving us some light and showing us that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and for giving us some ideas on how to change. So thank you. Such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Stay courageous. The Courage Effect is brought to you by Weller Collaboration. If you're looking to enhance your leadership skills or get more comfortable with change, please reach out to us. Our team of coaches, advisors, and consultants would love to help you get out of your comfort zone, operate in a braver brain space, and achieve even more amazing results. More information about Weller Collaboration is available in the show notes. Please spread the word about the Courage Effect. Rate and review on your favorite podcast platform, and we would love for you to share with your colleagues, family, or anyone in your universe who could use a good dose of courage. If you have feedback or would like to apply to be a guest, please reach out to us via our website, thecourageeffect.com. Manny Mathers is our producer. Dave Nelson composed our theme music. Alex Sandyforth is our administrative maven, and I'm your host, Suzanne Weller.